Well, it's a warm morning. Bob showed up with a bunch of saws, and I guess I did too. I'm not sure we have a specific mission today, but...
A couple of mini missions.
Yeah, a couple of mini missions.
We sure didn't have this weather. When I left the house this morning at 5, it was pouring rain.
Yeah. So what are we going to talk about now?
Well, this is, we got this idea from Everett, who watches some of these videos, and Everett lives up in Maine, and he gave me a call at the store. He said, why don't you guys do a video on a 254? Or as they say it up there, the 254. So anyway, Walt and I kicked this around. Well, we got to do more than just that. We might as well do the whole chassis here. So 254, 257, and 262. And again, it's like the project standpoint. How are they related? What interchanges, what doesn't? There's actually a lot of confusion on these because the 254 is a physically smaller saw.
You gotta keep you have to have a tank in there.
Well, we're gonna have the tank. Yeah. Well, why do we have the tank? We'll do that in a little bit. So this saw, Walt and I kind of designate this saw as the easiest saw in the world to work on. You know, the choke lever's got to come out, you just do that. I mean, everything is just so quick to do this. Unlike other saws that have gotten some recent bad press. So, we're going to start with the little one, the 254xp. Kind of the first one on the chassis. It started out as the 154 back when they had the 100 series stuff. Might want to bring that in close to get some of the...
Feel like a freaking yo-yo here.
Yeah. Oh yeah, if you go back and forth with that, people are going to be getting seasick watching this. Okay, what these saws got in common is a crankcase. And with the crankcase, your intake and everything is going to be similar. The 254, they all have the same crankcase. The 254 has a different crank because it's got a shorter stroke. The 257 and the 262 actually share a crank. They have different intakes, different top covers, and a few things like that. They all use the intake block. They use really the same carburetor. The linkages are a little bit the same. This is the intake block here. I've left out the...
It's going to come around from the other side so you can see that.
Yeah, get the sun in there. Interchangeability. I'm going to go through this quick, and people have to hit repeat because there's a lot of stuff that does interchange that you think wouldn't, and then there's stuff that doesn't that you think should. 257 and the 254 share that intake block. They share the air filter holder, and they all share this this choke lever here, and all three saws share the carburetor bolts. Don't ever lose those. You cannot get that carburetor bolt anywhere. There's nothing, because it's as you see on a 272, these carburetor bolts are sleeved. They got the plastic sleeve on there to prevent some of the heat transfer coming up into the carburetor. These linkages here, another thing that's real easy to get out. If you need to get your throttle link out, that's all you do. I mean, how can it be any quicker than that? Not like some saws where you got to take the whole trigger housing out. The 254, this is kind of a Husky thing, they share a few things with actually the 55, which are the tank, the top handle, and the muffler. This is one of my hokey, just do it for myself, muffler mods. 3/8 drill on either side. You know, obviously I wouldn't send one out to anybody like that, but the 55 and the 254 muffler is really restricted. It's got inside, you got this little hole, and then you got the box in there with the small holes. So the 254 actually responds pretty good to the muffler mod, whereas the 57 and the 62 already had a really good muffler with a good size hole. So you can modify those, but I think you're just going to get more noise. Side covers. There's two different side covers on these things. The early ones were plastic, which is what's on this, and on Walt's 257 and on my 257 here. After a while, they, I think this is like 94, 95, they switched the chassis over to the metal side cover. There's not complete interchangeability with these. You cannot get the plastic side cover anymore. You get some of the individual parts, but it's an act of Congress to rebuild those things. You have to do a little modification on the metal cover if you want to get it to fit on the older saw, the older crankcase. There's plenty of service bulletins on these. You know, people kind of worship the 262. It's a good saw. I think it's a little overrated. You know, with the 562s, every time there's a service bulletin, it's front page news. There was an awful lot of bulletins on these things that everybody kind of just doesn't remember. So next up, you got the 262 and the 257. That's where we start getting into some differences. Now, another little interchangeability deal. That filter is a little smaller.
On which one?
Huh?
Which is smaller?
Well, this air filter is smaller. A lot of people don't know this, but like the 242 air filter fits in these saws.
Oh, no kidding.
All right. The reason I got it in here, this is a little bit tricky, but this is one of the experiments. This 257 had a wipe cylinder. So what we tried to do, this is a 262 kit, and it's an aftermarket kit. And you know, I'm not really big on these, but the reason I wanted to mess around with this is because you cannot get the OEM 262 top end anymore. So I figured I'd get one of these and try it. It's hit and miss. This one was a hit. It worked out pretty good. But, you know, if you order the same thing from the same place, you're going to get the same part, who knows? It's just kind of a crapshoot. So anyway, one of the things with doing this, you have the different top covers with the 62 and the 57. We'll show that a little closer in a minute. But the carburetor bolts come out of the 257 cylinder at a different angle than they do in a 262. And I guess if the 262 is a little flatter, on the 257 the carburetor bolts come up at a little bit of different angle. I mean, it's not that much, I'm exaggerating a little bit. So what that does is that raises this whole air filter thing up a little bit. And when you use the bigger air filter, and when you do this, if you want to stick with the 257 top cover, it bumps into it. There's a little bit of interference, and you really need to put a couple of spacers so you can still use those bolts, the two bolts that hold down the air filter holder. Otherwise, this was actually kind of fun to run. The top dog that everybody gets all excited about is the 262. There's some major differences here other than just the cylinder. This is a different air filter setup. You got a two-piece top cover. You cannot get this anymore. I actually ought to go through the NLA stuff all at once at the end, right?
Yeah.
So you have this different intake setup, and you use a different air filter, different holder, and different air filter holders as well. So this is something that if you have to replace the top, you would have to replace the entire intake and get that other filter holder, which I think you can still get that one, but you probably can't get this one.
You know, the 262 I have in the garage has
Yeah.
got a different handle too. It's got like a little cover on the side.
What, this thing here?
Yeah.
That's an early one.
Okay.
There was a couple of things, like little two screws that held that thing in.
Yeah.
I have no idea what was supposed to go in there. There's all kinds of stories about it. I've looked into it. It doesn't show anything. I guess if you keep it not much more than a Band-Aid in there. One of the things with the 262s that's quite a bit different is they use a different mount setup versus the 57 and the 54. And you got this big spring mount here. You've got a spring mount here and a spring mount here. Now remember, the crankcase is actually the same. There's a small rubber one here. And this was one of the first ones with the spring anti-vibe. And some of them, this one isn't bad, but some of them almost feel like there's something loose. And you constantly have this idea that you should be going and tightening something up. And the reason is that when they were doing these, unlike all the new saws like the 72s and 562s and all that, they don't have the mount on the cylinder, which kind of ties it all together with that tri-mass vibe system that they have. So these saws didn't have that. Sometimes it feels a little too mushy. If it does feel a little too mushy, you want to get rid of these springs in the back. These are also the same springs that you use on a 288. 288 also had rubber mounts. So if you get the 288 rubber mounts, you stick them in there, you'll tighten this thing up, and it won't be quite as floppy. So, word about this tank. If you break it, you can't get them anymore. So that's another thing that's not available. Solution is, I had to do this twice now in the shop, is guys come in with the tank. Usually it's busted up here. Once you break that, you can't mount it. The solution is to go to the, you can set it up with the 257, 254 tank, which is also the 55 tank. And we got an example of that here, just so guys can see what we're talking about. These tanks have 2 mounts on each side, top and bottom, and on this side here. It does fit this crankcase, and it's kind of interesting that these points all line up with the 55 chassis. So it really couldn't have been too much of an accident. The only difference is you use different mounts when you're using this chassis versus the 55. The 55, the mounts slide in, they're hollow. You've done that probably, you know what I mean.
Yep.
Well, the 254 and 257 mounts, it's a harder mount, and there's a female acceptance of these screws here, so you screw the crankcase in, and that tightens it up. So really, it'll feel more like a 257 as far as how tight it is and what kind of vibration you get. But it's really the only way to keep the thing going unless you can find a tank. And the tank was it was pretty expensive, you know, when it was still available.
So to summarize that, because that's actually a significant point, is the 262 was an early spring anti-vibe system.
Yeah, I think it was the first one. It was also the first saw with the air injection intake too.
And then the 254 has a hard rubber mount.
Right.
And same as the 257.
Yes.
And you can retro the tank handle and anti-vibe from the 254, 257, 55, 51, and the like back to the 262s.
Yeah.
To keep them running.
Because then you'll end up with this deal. Here again, the crankcase is the same. And now we just have 2 rubber mounts here, and then one here and then one on the other side. Another thing that's a little top covers. Top covers are starting to go. With the 262, if you want to get both pieces, the last time I looked, which was about 6 months ago, you could get a complete set. You can get both pieces, but you can't buy just this. It won't be long before that's all gone.
How much do they cost?
Boy.
Is it pricey?
No, it's not that bad. It's probably 60 bucks. I'm just guessing. 254 and 257 top covers are a little bit different in the sense that it's the 257, which is on top, is a little taller. 254 covers are history. You can't get these anymore. The 257 top actually will fit on the 254. So there is some stuff you can mess around with here.
So you can put the filter and cover on a 254 if you're in a pinch.
Well, yeah. Well, the filter on the 54 and the 57 are actually really the same thing. So you can. The only difference is that you can put the 257 cover on a 254, but not the other way around because you got a height issue. So it's sort of like the XT 372s. You just get a little taller cover because the cylinder's taller. So that's some of the stuff. If you guys looking for project material, and that's kind of why we're talking about this in this context, is because if you don't buy a complete saw, you want to make sure that you know what you can get and what you can't get.
I'm going to get this thing away from your feet.
Otherwise the project stalls. Well, I haven't tripped over it yet.
Too many years playing ice hockey.
Huh?
Too many years playing ice hockey.
Yeah, I know. Falling up the stairs. So, I don't know, what am I leaving out? Doesn't talk about the cylinders much.
Well, open versus
254 and 262 are really the typical closed port cylinders from that area. Fed through a windowed piston. I know one thing I left out. The 257 is an straight open port, straight up and down. Building these saws, the guys that want to hot rod them a little bit, the 54 and the 62 got a lot of squish from the factory, and you can't just
no base gasket
and squirt the stuff out of the tube. But what not too many people are aware of is that there's actually 2 gaskets for these things. I think they're 20 and 30 thousandths. They're about 10 thousandths difference. The IPLs are really confusing on which one you should use, and I know that the one that's more common is the thicker one. But one thing, I can tell guys when you're looking up these part numbers, the gasket that ends in 01 is the thinner gasket, and that's the one that you really want to use in any of these builds.
Well, check your switch first. They did it for a reason.
Well, I know what the reason was, but use the, you don't have to check anything. You just go to a thinner gasket and you're going to get real good squish from the factory.
Picks up power.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you don't have to measure everything, but the thicker gasket ends in a 0.2. And you know, you can measure them, but you can just feel them with your hands. You can feel there's a difference between them. The thinner gasket was used in a 261, which we haven't really talked about here. They wanted to detune these saws, and part of it was an EPA thing. The 261 was essentially a 262 with really two differences. They used a dished piston, you know, that's just like, we all hate the dished piston. They used a dished piston and it had a really restricted muffler. From the outside, it doesn't sound the same as a 262 or a 257 muffler. And it kind of looks a little bit the same from the outside, but inside around that hole, they built that box with the real small holes in it. It's really restrictive. The second year of the 261, they realized that they had to do something. So what they did, I don't think I got one here, but what they did is they put a couple of slots right here in this front plate to give it a little more outlet. That muffler needs to be really changed because that muffler is very, so anyway, there was that. And the 261, because they had the dish piston, that did use that thinner gasket. But the best way to do it, and you get a fair amount of, see, I don't measure it with tools, I just do this. But that's with the thinner gasket in there.
It's got good pop.
Yeah, so it's got good pop, like we call it. So that's kind of just the overview of these things. They're the easiest saws to work on. You know, you got to be able to move around with some of the parts. Because anything that uses those 55 parts, it's easy to get them for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Top ends. OEM top ends, there are none left for the 57, none left for the 62, and there's less than 10 in Husky right now on the 54s. And the last time I looked a few weeks ago, there was 8 left. And I think when those 8 are gone, it's over. So now you're starting, if you can't salvage the cylinders, now you're considering, you know, aftermarket options for top ends to keep these saws going. There's some good, there's some bad, and it's almost impossible to tell what you're going to get. So that's the overview on these. So Everett, if we're probably going to play with these a little bit. The 254, it's kind of in its own category. There is, by the way, there's no red versions of any of these saws. Johnswood never had anything on this chassis. At the time, you know, they kept for their 60cc saw, they were still going with the 630. The 630 Super, yeah, it was built on a heavier chassis. And they also had that 2054, 2055 chassis that kind of crept into the mid-range. You know, at 54 cc's, this thing is kind of half in the 50cc class and half in the 60. And it's got quite a bit of snap to it. Weight-wise, you know, it doesn't really feel to me any different than a 55 as far as the weight class goes. So you got a fair amount of performance in a good package here. You know, some guys that have run them a lot say it's a really good saw. I don't disagree with that. You know, we run too many saws because we could pick a different favorite every month. But if you can get a hold of these things, they're pretty stout. They hold up very well. And I don't know, kind of just rambling on now, but.
Well, there are a couple of things that I found interesting. One is, I don't know if it's the same with the 262 because I haven't got into them yet, but they use a 6202 bearing, which is the same one that the 372 uses.
And a 346.
And also
they use that in like 500 different things.
Yeah, and the seal is the same seal that you use on the PTO side of the. No, I'm sorry. It's the same seal that's used on the flywheel side of the 372. So seals and bearings, if you're doing cases on those, are real easy. And the second thing is on. Oh, geez. Get my fat ass in here.
Yeah, come on, get over here.
On this side, underneath the flywheel, there's sort of like a plastic cover that has the seal in it. It fits over the case, and they're a little bit recessed. And if you do bearings, you got to make sure that bearing is actually pushed into the case far enough for the recess to actually go in there. Otherwise, you're going to have a massive air leak. And the other thing Bob was pointing out is these mufflers, they are really restricted. They have a little box that's kind of tack welded on the inside. And you take that box out and open up this here, what a difference. It makes a huge difference on how much back pressure there is. Another thing that Bob was pointing out to me this morning is they come set up with different chain sizes, where you have the larger ones with the 3/8 and the 254s were 325s, correct?
Yeah, although...
Is it the same clutch?
There's some, no, the 262 had its own clutch. It had a 3-shoe clutch. The 54 and the 57 use a 2-shoe clutch, which is also the same clutch as on a 55.
That's good stuff. Yeah.
If you go to that 3-shoe clutch though, there's a washer that you have to get to go with it, because the 2-shoe clutch has an offset and it won't interfere with the drum, but you got to have a spacer washer if you go to a 3-shoe clutch. The thing with the bars, and these are all narrow tail bars by the way.
262 as well?
The whole family, yeah. The 262 you could also order with 325. Some guys sold them that way. You know, it's the pulpwood thing. 254s, you could get them, you know, 3/8 or 325. You know, the 257 as the open port was kind of, you know, it doesn't have XP written on it. You know, so there was a little more of a, and of course it sold in the biggest numbers. It was kind of a firewood saw. It's the funny thing is, like back then, the 257 would sell great, but now what you would call its grandson, the 555, just doesn't sell as well. And there's no logical reason for that, other than the fact that this XP silliness has like a marketing term. It's too successful, and the guys are just like, oh, it doesn't say XP on it. It's a homeowner saw. Of course, I'm not getting into that debate now, but that's obviously not correct.
Oh, you did bring up the dished piston, so the 350s weren't the first ones to go through that treatment. Remember the 350s with the 53s? So it's a
so
trend.
anyway, they took like the 262 is a great saw, but then the 261, it's like, you know, how can we ruin the thing? And that's what they did with it.
Huh. Well, here's a 257 that has the 3/8 chain. Boy, the camera's way over there, but you can see what the muffler looks like. Let me bring that up close. See if that'll pick up. You see that right in there? Here's a 254 was stuck together a while back. And see that right there? Along with hacking out the inside. And this one is that 2-shoe clutch, and it has, you were right, it has a 325 sprocket. Bob's always right.
Not always. I just...
Had to bring a 555 just for size comparison.
Yeah, and since the 555 is here, I guess it reminds me of another point that this is almost not fair, but the 555 is just about one of the smoothest saws you could ever possibly run. You know, when you got the hard rubber mounts in here, and the 57s and the 54s, you know, in a contemporary sense, back when they were made, it wasn't bad. But in today's world, with stuff that's as smooth as the 555, these saws, you're going to think they vibrate a lot. You're going to notice the vibrations on them.
And that is a fact.
Well, yeah, because you noticed that with your 57.
Well, the 555 has spoiled me.
Yeah, as far as vibration goes, yeah.
Oh my God.
It's the most comfortable saw to run. Now you've been running, you've got some video time with your 257.
Yeah.
And you're starting with like the good workhorse saw. And now you're going to start going into the 54s and the 62s, and you're going to have even more fun with them. Yeah. Well, the thing is, the 54 was never replaced, and here again, you have to think in the marketing segments of what was going on. You know, when the 254 had on one end of it, it had the 242, which is we've covered that a little bit in the past, and then on the other end, it had the 262. So. You know, there was some space between there, but then the 346 came out, and they nudged the whole thing up a little bit, and the 346 was supposed to kind of cover both ends of that. So the 50 here again, it's unique as being kind of a mid 50 cc saw. One little, it's not very significant, but you know, like I said, the 254 originally started as the 154, and then after the 262 came out with the air injection, they gave the air injection to the other saws in the family. And one way you can tell, this is an earlier starter, although not necessarily on the earlier saw, but if you got the early starter with this small decal here, you don't have the air injection. If you got this starter here with the larger style decal, which is missing, and I don't think you can get that anymore or not. I'll see if I can get you one, but that means you do have the air injection. There was a difference in the crankcase. They changed the crankcase. So while the starters pretty much swap over, one thing that's different is the air shroud, the air conductor that goes between the starter and the flywheel. They're different on the air injection and the non-air injection saws. The newer shrouds are definitely still available. The earlier ones I don't know. And the other thing that's different on them too is for part of the air injection deal was that muffler, the exhaust deflector that's between the muffler and the cylinder. That's different.
I noticed that too.
That's different, and the other thing that's different is, because it molds with the crankcase, even though it's kind of interchangeable, the left or the flywheel side of the crankcase on the pre-air injection saws is a little different, because they had to make that, and you can still use, and it's not like the 61s and 272s, you know, it's all the same ignition and everything, but there's just a couple little differences there, so sometimes like things don't quite fit, you got to make them work. We'll keep remembering other little details. About these.
Well, as we go through the day, if we come up, we'll pick them up and we'll put them into the video. Editors are wonderful things.
Yeah, okay.
Anything else?
Not at the moment.
All right, on to the next subject.